Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us for today's webinar. I'm Stephen Rice from the Phillips Group, and I'm here today with our presenter Mark Armstrong, who will be delivering today's webinar on behalf of the Queensland Government's Department of Tourism Major Events, Small Business and the Commonwealth Games. The topic of today's webinar is preparing your business for the storm season. So just as an overview of what to expect, as you'll see in today's agenda, we'll have a short introduction, 5 minutes, and then the bulk of the presentation, where Mark will cover off on the key points of the workbook, will go for about 35 minutes. So a bit of an overview of our presenter, Mark. He's an expert in disaster management and business resilience. He has significant experience in these areas, having worked with the Army and the Queensland Reconstruction Authority. Mark, at this point, I'll hand over to you.
Thanks, Stephen, and good afternoon, everybody. It's great to see such a large group participating today, and we've got people from right across Queensland and beyond, with another number of other people from interstate, and representatives from all different types of businesses. So it's I commend you on your participation today and taking some time out to think about this important topic. In terms of an overview, the key takeaways from this presentation today, if you remember nothing else, remember these: that the importance of knowing the risks to your business, having a plan, practicing the plan, and that there's a whole load of useful resources provided to you through portals such as the Queensland State Government Business and Industry Portal that are very useful to help prepare your business for the storm season. Along the bottom of the page on each slide, to help orientate yourself to where we are throughout the presentation today, is that diagram that's got the red circle around it. So if you look at the dark blue box within that diagram, that'll tell you whereabouts we are in the presentation. At the moment, we're in the introduction phase. I want to start by discussing the key concept of resilience. So the importance of this was driven home in Queensland, in particular last year, with the extensive and serious flood and weather events that affected much of the state. Queensland Government, as it was looking at supporting the rebuilding and reconstruction effort, we saw many examples of communities and businesses. Some seemed to recover better and faster than others, and it led to a lot of work on the idea of resilience. And the summary of that work is presented in a very useful publication published by the Queensland Reconstruction Authority and available on the website, called Rebuilding a Stronger, More Resilient Queensland. And there's a picture of it on the slide there. So that publication defined resilience as the capacity to prevent, mitigate, prepare for, respond to, and recover from the impacts of disaster. Specifically, that more resilience means that disaster may be avoided, that if it is felt that the effects are less, and that they recover faster. And you can think about it in terms of the individual, you can think about it in terms of the organisation, in this case the business, and also the community. And if we use the analogy of a human being and their resilience in terms of health, you can think of a healthy person who's resilient is less likely to get sick. If they do get sick, that they're less affected than others, and that they recover faster. So use that analogy to think about your business. How resilient is it to disaster? What can you do to make it more resilient? And what we're going to focus on today is a simple and useful tool called the Business Continuity Plan, which will help you do that. So the Business Continuity Plan, what is it? Why is it important? And what does it look like? So start firstly with what it is. And there's a definition there on the top of the slide. So it's essentially a framework for building resilience and the capability for an effective response within an organisation. Now, why is it important? Why is this a sign of prudent management? Well, it shows that as a manager or a leader in your business, it shows that you've considered the key risks that are confronting the business, that you and your organisation is prepared for disaster, and that you and your organisation are empowered to act if disaster happens. So potentially a very important document. What's in it? So I've listed there on the slide some of the typical contents for it, and there's a profile and a template available both in your workbook, and there are many templates available online, including at the Queensland Government Business and Industry portal, and I'll show you how to get to those later on. So there are plenty of templates available, and obviously the template that you use for your business will depend on its location, its size, its context, and so on. And at this point we'll do a live poll, and the question is, does your business have a current business continuity plan? So in terms of the results for that poll, we had results of the answer yes, my business has a current business continuity plan was 49%, no was 42%, and uncertain was 9%. And that's a reasonably typical result from my experience. Sort of roughly half do and roughly half don't. And it's an important consideration. We'll see by the end of this presentation if that half, that 42% that don't currently, we'll see how many of them reconsider that after this presentation. Okay, so what's a framework for considering a business continuity plan? So I'll introduce you to this very useful model. It's called the PPRR model, and that's simply an abbreviation that stands for Prevention, Preparedness, Response and Recovery. So this is a model that's used by emergency management agencies and professionals as a comprehensive process to consider how to approach and respond to disaster. In this instance, we'll be using this model to help you prepare your business continuity plan, and we'll move through the phases of this model in preparing that plan today. So a useful model, and we'll be using it to structure this presentation today. So let's start with prevention. And the key activity for developing a business continuity plan in this phase is understanding your risk. So what does that mean? What are the steps involved? Firstly, let's define risk. A simple definition of risk is the effect of uncertainty on your business objectives. In this context of disaster, how will that disaster impact your business objectives? Now, in the instance of the disaster, it's mostly negative impacts, but there might well be some positive impacts, and we'll talk about that later in the presentation. Okay, so what is that risk? What are the steps to understand that risk? On the slide, there are 5 simple steps. We'll go through them, and then we'll go through a simple example about how you move through those steps. So step 1 is to identify those risks which could impact your business, to analyse their risk in terms of their impact on your business. Step 3 is to evaluate the risk, to prioritise their management. Step 4 is to treat those risks to minimise their impact where possible. And step 5 is to capture that process in a risk management plan. That's an ongoing process. So let's step through a simple example. So, say in your business that you identify that a particular risk is that your power supply is interrupted because of an event that occurs during the storm season. So you've identified that risk. So what does that mean for your business? So the impact of that risk might be that it interrupts your production, or it interrupts your computer system or your security systems. So you analyse that risk to understand the impact. You then evaluate that risk to understand its priority, and typically that's looking at likelihood and consequence. So how likely is it? How serious is the consequence, to help you understand the priority? Is it a high risk? Is it a medium risk? Is it an extreme risk? In this instance, it might be identified as a high risk. So step 4, you then think about how you can treat that risk to minimise its impact. And an example of treating that risk might be to have a standby generator on site, or perhaps to improve the infrastructure, so putting power lines underground, for example, to minimise that risk. And then step 5 is then incorporating that plan, the contingency plan, if required, in an overall risk management plan. So that's a very simple example. And there's an example of that process in your workbook. There's a fictional company called Oz Coffee in your workbook that shows the example of that. So, what are some of the things that we want to consider specifically about storm season? Here in Queensland, the Bureau of Meteorology is predicting quite sizable weather events this storm season, which in Queensland typically runs from November through until April. So there's storm events being predicted, and certainly there's something that we see a lot of in Queensland. The major flooding and cyclone events that we saw last year affected over 13,000 small to medium businesses in this state, with up to 3% of those critically impacted. So what does this mean for your business? And already in Brisbane this year, we've seen on the 17th and 18th of November some severe storm activity. So it's certainly something that's in the front of many of our minds. So what are some of the considerations for your business? In terms of the risks for severe storms, the likely events that are associated with them, such as heavy rain, hail, and high winds. Flooding, your business might be affected by the storm flooding as a result of storm surge or sea surge. It might be flooding as a result of runoff or riverbanks bursting, or perhaps backflow from drains. And finally, another one to consider during summer is bushfires. And there's certainly a lot of warnings around about bushfires at the moment because of the amount of vegetation that there is that was generated as a result of the high rains the high rains earlier in this year and the previous year. So they're things to think about. Which one of those will affect your business? So you need to consider how this might affect you directly and indirectly. So what I mean by that is an event might have a direct impact on your business. For example, your factory might get flooded or your product destroyed by a storm event. But it's also important to think laterally about what the indirect impacts might be and how might your supply chain be affected, so those of your suppliers, and how product and goods flow downstream towards the customer, and how information and cash flows upstream in that supply chain. How are your suppliers and customers affected, but also your employees and contractors and so on. Many businesses will be affected indirectly, and probably many more than are affected directly. There are resources available to help you cue your thoughts about particular risks associated with the storm season. And one good resource is on the Tourism Queensland website called Weatherproof Your Business, and that has a number of case studies and tools that you can use to think about storm season in particular, and there'll be a link to that later on. At this point, we'll have a live poll talking about, or asking, has your business been affected by a storm season event in the past 2 years? So the results of that poll are as follows. 64% said yes, so answered yes to their business being affected by storm season events in the past 2 years, and 36% no. So roughly 2/3 have been affected, 1/3 not so much, and that does demonstrate that the majority of businesses have been impacted in the last 2 years. Therefore, thinking about a business continuity plan should be important for all of us. So what are some of the tools that you can use to help analyse and manage this risk? It might seem like a daunting task at first, but there are many very simple and very well used tools that you can use to do it, and a little bit of effort can give you a lot of benefit. The first one is a risk matrix, and there's an example in the workbook on page 11, and there's also templates available in the Queensland Government Business and Industry portal. If you look in the blue boxes that run along the top of the slide, starting with risk and likelihood on the left and following across, that forms the heading of a simple matrix, a simple risk matrix. And if you go along and fill in each of those boxes, that steps you through a risk understanding process. Firstly, identification, then evaluation, then mitigation. The coloured table is a risk table, and again, there's an example of that in the workbook, and these are very common and easily available. It helps describe helps you identify the priority for the risk that you're dealing with. And the easiest way and the most common way to judge risk is in terms of likelihood and consequence. So that table shows likelihood going down the left-hand side and the consequence along the top. So simply matching the answer for your risk to that will give you how serious that risk is, whether it's low in the green, medium in the yellow, high in the orange, or extreme in the red. Very simple but very, very powerful tool. So by a pretty simple process you can articulate and document this knowledge that's probably already in your business. And it's the opportunity to sit down and think about what if this happened? What would it mean? What if that happened? What would it mean? You know, what is the most important things that we should be looking to mitigate early on? So many useful tools available. So once you've analysed the risk and you've got an idea of what they are, you can then think about the options to mitigate and treat that risk. And there are 4 broad options available: avoid, reduce, transfer, or accept. So we'll talk about each one of those a little more in detail. First option is to avoid. So what's that mean? That means that you seek to literally avoid the activity that's generating the risk. For example, if your production process was at risk by a storm season event, a way to avoid that risk would be to shut down your facility during that period. It's an extreme measure, but by doing that, you then avoid the risk. Another way you might avoid the risk is to achieve the same outcome, but by doing it a different way. And an example of that is if you've got a key piece of IT infrastructure, like a server, that's at risk, physical risk from a storm event. A way to avoid that risk, to achieve the same outcome, might be to store your IT systems on the cloud and thereby avoid that risk to your physical infrastructure. The second option is to reduce the risk. There are 2 ways to think about reduction of risk. You can reduce the likelihood of something happening, or you can reduce the impact. So the likelihood of something happening, for example, is if you've got a key road that you need to get your produce to market along that floods regularly. If that road is improved, so it floods less regularly, you've reduced your risk. The other way to think about it is to reduce the impact. So a common example of this is manufacturing organisations who build stock during the summer. And recently had a tour of the Forex brewery here in Brisbane, the Castlemaine Perkins Brewery, which you might remember last year we saw the pictures of Lang Park and the Castlemaine Perkins Brewery underwater. So they had a severe impact to their production. They'd shut down between 7 and 8 weeks with next to no production. Yet they didn't run out of stock. They were still able to service their customers. How did they do that? They built stock as part of their risk reduction strategy, is to build stock prior to the storm season, and they were holding something between 8 and 10 weeks of stock. When the disaster occurred, which allowed them to continue supply. So a good example of a risk reduction strategy that worked. The third option is to transfer the risk. So this is where you seek to shift the risk to someone else, and you might pay a premium to do it, but someone else is then responsible for managing it. The common example of that, of course, is insurance. So you pay someone else a premium to accept that risk, and insurance is a very important means for doing it. And one of the common outcomes from disasters is that many individuals and businesses discover that they're underinsured. So a very good thing to do as part of this risk management strategy is to review your insurance arrangements and make sure that they're appropriate and the right things are being insured to the right amount. Another way to transfer risk might be to outsource a process. So you let someone else take responsibility for it rather than carrying that responsibility yourself. And finally, the final option is to accept the risk. So there'll be instances where a particular risk might be very unlikely or very costly to reduce, and you may choose to accept that risk, understand that it's there, and live with it. And an example of that is in Grantham in the Lockyer Valley that was affected by severe flash floods on January 10, 2011. A number of businesses were destroyed by fast-moving floodwater. At least 2 of those chose to rebuild on their current locations, and they had their own reasons for doing it. But that's demonstrating that they've chosen to accept the risk that something similar may happen again. But they made a decision to accept that risk. So they're examples of how you might mitigate and treat risk. So moving on to contingency planning. So you'll have means to mitigate and treat risk. Some of those might be reflected in contingency plans. So these, in effect, represent standing plans to enact if a particular situation happens. So some common contingency plans that businesses might have. A manufacturing business might have a contingency plan for alternate suppliers for one of their raw materials. So if supplier A is affected by an event, they can switch with minimal effort and fuss to supplier B, and that would represent a contingency plan. A direct example for an organisation is that many organisations have redundancy in their facilities so that they can switch processes and operations from one facility that may be affected to another that is not. And we saw manufacturers here in Queensland shift some production to other facilities both within the state and interstate in order to continue supply when one of their facilities was directed. So those processes would be captured in a contingency plan. Important thing to consider with contingency plans, so what are the triggers to enact them? So when are they enacted, and that would form a critical part of your contingency plan. So moving on to the next phase, so moving into preparedness. Preparedness is a really key phase for most businesses. This is where most businesses are most of the time, and it's where the best intended, best structured business continuity plan can be undone by complacency and lack of focus. So there are some considerations there on the slide which reflect the importance of your mindset during this phase about being proactive and planning for an event, a personal commitment to plan, to think about, to prepare for disaster, and the desire to actually see that through and practice your business continuity arrangements. And a simple example for us all that we've dealt with is to think about the fire drill that we commonly and routinely do. A fire drill is very different in theory when you're sitting down at a desk and talking about it to practicing one or rehearsing one under benign conditions, and actually doing one for real. And it's in this phase that the quality of your business continuity plan will be enhanced greatly by practice and rehearsal. So a key tool to consider using, or to use during this phase, is called a business impact analysis, a BIA. So an example of this is on page 14 of the workbook, and it's a very useful and simple tool to basically help you understand what are your critical business activities. What are those business activities of yours that are most important? Now this sounds like a simple question, but you'd be surprised how many haven't thought about this systematically and logically. And it's only if you understand this that you can that this understanding will allow you to prioritise what's most important. If there's a disaster, what do you bring back online first? What is that that's most important? And so what are some of the examples of things that might be critical business activities? For a lot of businesses these days, it's their computer systems that they rely on those to trade, to get paid, to make payments, to accept orders, to ship orders. So they're critical for a lot of businesses these days. It might be the records and documents of your organisation that's critical. If you're a farmer, it might be the ability, your fuel supplies, or the ability to get product to market in a timely manner. So it just depends on the context of your business and how it generates income. So the BIA is a very simple and useful tool to help you understand what is most important. And as an example, like it's no good putting a lot of effort into reopening your flood-affected shop if you can't take an order or accept payment from your customers. So an understanding of those priorities will help you prioritise the work to get back on track. So moving into the response phase. So this phase describes something's happened or it's about to happen, it's imminent. So how does your business respond? What are some of the mechanisms that you can use to manage a response? The first one that's recommended, and it's used by many businesses, is called a critical incident response team or critical incident management team, depending on where you work. So this is an organisation within the business, a number of people who are prepared, empowered, and with a response mindset that are activated in the event of a disaster. So they'll have other jobs day to day, but they'll be, in the event of a disaster, they'll have a particular role in leading and managing a response. So why is this important? It's important because of human nature, and humans can have a lot of trouble coping with sudden change, and a disaster can be a huge and traumatic change for many people, particularly if they're not prepared for it. The idea of having a critical incident response team is that you've got individuals who, with the right mindset, to respond and help a business manage an incident. And in examples of businesses that I've worked in consumer goods businesses, they'll have critical incident management teams ready to act in the event that a product needs to be recalled, for example. They can spring into action and ensure that the important decisions are being made in a timely and effective manner. So if you have a team, they'll need a plan to work to. So an incident response plan is an important thing. And on screen there's an example of some of the things that you might consider in developing that plan. They're relatively low level and tactical responses. They're the type of things that you might be considering in your incident response plan. The important thing is that it's tailored to include the likely scenarios or the likely risks that you'll be confronting and have been identified in your risk analysis in the early stage. It will need to articulate when the incident response team and responses are triggered. What are the events? What are the indicators and warnings that you're looking for to trigger that response? What are the roles and responsibilities for key people in the organisation? What's the communication plan? A very important piece of any response. And they'll usually feature checklists and templates. Time of crisis is usually accompanied by feelings of stress and fatigue. So checklists and templates are very useful to ensure that people are following a good process and considering everything they need to consider. So finally, if you've got an incident response plan and a critical incident management team, they'll deal with the initial response, but there'll be a broader response that has to be mobilised within the business, and it's very important to consider a number of things, and there's some dot points on the screen to introduce some of those considerations. It's important that you've got processes in place to define and understand what's changed, what's the situation that's being dealt with, what are the decisions that have to be made now. How is the situation changing? Is it likely to get worse or is it getting better? What is the key information that you need to determine those things? And it's always a useful planning tool to assume worst case, and then that covers you for a worst case option. Some important things to consider in mobilising a response is in relation to the human dimension. So I mentioned that the typical human response, emotional response to a crisis, will include things like fear, uncertainty, distraction, grief, heightened emotions like panic and stress. And you need to be able to identify those responses in yourself, in your staff, and the people you're dealing with during this phase. And finally, it's important to consider your business's reputation. How your business responds to disaster is likely to be being closely observed by a number of different stakeholder groups, and that might include your staff, your competitors, the community that you work in, and they'll be monitoring and measuring your response. And it's important to consider your business's reputation, how your business's reputation might be impacted in that response phase. So effective use of a communication plan will go a long way towards protecting and perhaps enhancing your business's reputation. So moving on to the final phase, recovery. So this, how will you bounce back? Will you get back to where you were before, or will you build back better? Or will you never reach those levels again? So recovering can be broadly divided into resumption of business activities and restoration of resources. So, for example, on the slide there to the left, we see the Lucky 7 store. So this is a general store located in Grantham. It was destroyed in the initial flood event. The photo there is them reopening in a temporary facility after a great deal of support from the community, the government, and a lot of effort from the owners themselves. It reopened within 111 days of the actual flood. They demonstrated a resilience and a determination to return to business, and that benefited many, many people in that community. But there are examples of other businesses in Grantham that haven't opened since then and probably will not. And you get a sense of how important resilience is, particularly in this recovery phase. So what are some of the key considerations in this phase? And there are a number of bullet points there on screen to consider. So the extent of the damage caused and how and what to repair and by when. The communication is a really key piece with stakeholders, and that might include customers, suppliers, the community, media, and so on. It's important to closely monitor and communicate constantly with your staff, that they understand their role in recovery, that you're watching closely how they've been impacted by the disaster and whether there's any lingering or persistent effects. And finally, it's important to capture the lessons learned. So something's happened, how can we use that, the lessons that we learned to make us better prepared, more resilient next time. This recovery phase can take a long time, particularly where people are concerned. They can be traumatised for some time to come. So recovery might be short or long, and it's likely that some parts of your recovery will take a lot longer than others. I'd just like to highlight the importance of looking for the opportunity in crisis. So some people are uncomfortable with this thought that you know, and there's a definite drawback to be identified as or being seen to profit from disaster. But I say this, like business has a very key role in the recovery of communities, and that as a business owner or manager, you have a responsibility to a number of stakeholders to get that business back on its feet, so it's contributing. It's hiring people, it's paying people, it's providing important products and services. And we've seen many examples of how this can happen in a way that's morally and ethically acceptable, that's benefited many stakeholders and the staff and owners of businesses. So how can we do that, and what are some of the considerations? So the dot points on the left of the slide are some of the things that you might think about. Are there new opportunities? Can you support your customers better? Is there a way to engage with and support your community that'll have benefit down the track? There's an example with Oz Coffee in the workbook about how they might benefit from opportunity, and I'll just talk quickly through an actual example from the floods in 2011 of a colleague of mine who had recently opened a small business. It was about 6 months old when the disaster struck in his region. It was severely affected. He and his facilities were not affected directly, but his business was, his customers were. So he saw demand dive and cash flow dry up very quickly, and his business, being so new, went very quickly to the brink. He had some decisions to make about how to respond. So what he did, he volunteered his staff and equipment to assist in community cleanup in his region, and that had a number of benefits, both for his staff and for his own business, and had a positive impact on his business's reputation. He used this experience, his volunteering experience, to develop a flood cleanup offering that he could use to assist other corporations, business, government departments with their cleanup. And through this flood offering, he was able to gain a number of new clients. And as a result, today his business is stronger and more resilient. So that's an example of a small example of one business about how it looked for opportunity in disaster and achieved a terrific outcome in a way that was morally and ethically acceptable. So, key message, keep looking for the opportunity. Finally, test the plan. I just want to emphasise this point again, that the best plan in the world, if it stays sitting on people's shelves or in their drawers, is going to be of limited value. It is very important to continually review the plan, to update it where things have changed, to train your people in it. It's a great opportunity to engage your stakeholders if you're practicing the plan, whether it be your customers or suppliers or community. And I just emphasise the value of conducting actual rehearsals and exercises to test the plan itself and to practice your people in it. in summary, these are the key points. Know and understand the risks for your business in responding to a disaster. Have a plan, a business continuity plan, and test this plan to the plan itself and your people and their understanding on it. And there are many resources available to you, which I'll refer you to shortly. There's plenty of resources online and plenty of support from both state and local government. And at this point, to conclude, or nearing the end, we'll do another poll. And the poll question in this instance is, are you going to take action to develop or refine your business continuity plan as a result of this workshop? So yes, no, or not sure. So the results of the poll are in, and of our participants today, 89% answered yes, that as a result of this workshop, they were going to take action to develop or refine their BCP. And we had 11% who were unsure, and probably similar to the 9% who are unsure if they had one or not. So, so I think an overwhelming majority of the participants will take this opportunity and use some of these resources to revise and update, and in some instances create a business continuity plan, which is certainly recommended and a good result. I'll conclude by referring you to some very useful information sources. The first one on screen is a link to the business and industry portal for the Queensland Government. And I'll show you a quick screenshot of that. So this is a business and industry portal, and you can see in this area, the risk management area, links and more information on the topics that we've been describing today. You'll also notice some very interesting topics there, and there's all sorts of useful information and tools to use, whether you're establishing a business or running a business already, and plenty of tools in this risk management and business continuity area. The other website, the second website that's linked to there is Tourism Queensland website, and that'll take you to weatherproofing your business material, which is also contains a number of useful workshops and case studies. On the business and industry portal, if you go to it and in the search function type webinars, you'll be able to find a recorded copy of this webinar and the list of the webinars that have been hosted already and are coming up. Likewise, if you search for within that website for business workshops, you'll get a list of the workshops that are offered by Queensland Government to support small and medium business, and I certainly commend those to you if you have an opportunity to attend. So finally, today, thank you very much for your participation. It's been a big group, and I appreciate your feedback, particularly in how you're going to respond and review your plans. And I'd like to close off by saying good luck, and I hope your preparation goes well for storm season and that business is good over the summer period. Thank you very much.